The truth behind my father's insensitive birthday gift. Generational conflict. Welcome to Silent Wars. In today's video, we dive deep into the complexities of generational conflict and how it impacts family dynamics. Whether it's a simple misunderstanding or a more serious clash between different generations, these conflicts can leave lasting emotional scars. Join us as we explore real-life stories and offer insights on how to navigate these challenging situations. If you find this video helpful, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to Silent Wars for more content like this. Let's dive in. At a birthday party meant to celebrate his 10-year-old daughter Amanda, Jack experienced a moment that would forever change his view of his family. The evening had started off with all the excitement of a special celebration: bright decorations, a beautifully crafted cake, and Amanda's glowing face as she eagerly anticipated her presence. The air was filled with laughter and warm greetings as the family gathered together. Jack, along with his wife Emily, had put everything in place to ensure that Amanda's big day would be memorable. She had been looking forward to it for months, imagining the joy of receiving presents from loved ones. A bike, art supplies, and a new dollhouse were among her wishes. However, what was supposed to be a joyful occasion quickly turned sour when Jack's father, Mike, arrived late to the party. His presence was accompanied by a familiar air of self-importance, as if he were the center of attention. But something was off this time. Instead of a carefully wrapped gift, Mike walked in with something that took everyone by surprise: a rough, damaged stick. Something you would find in the backyard, not a thoughtful present for a child. As he handed it over to Amanda, who stared at it with confusion, Mike nonchalantly said, "Your birthday present." The room fell silent. Jack's heart sank as his stomach churned with disbelief. His father's tone, as if it were no big deal, echoed in Jack's ears, and a wave of betrayal hit him hard. The awkwardness in the room was palpable as guests exchanged uneasy glances, not knowing how to react. Jack, unable to hide his growing anger, stared at his father in disbelief. Mike, seemingly unfazed, smirked and casually remarked that expensive gifts were reserved for other grandchildren. The words stung like a slap in the face, cutting deeper than Jack could have imagined. It wasn't just the gift. This moment symbolized years of neglect, favoritism, and selfish behavior from his father. The sheer callousness of it all was too much for Jack to take in. This wasn't a joke. It was an insult. A final reminder of how little his father had ever truly cared about him and his family. A deep sense of anger washed over Jack. But it wasn't just anger, it was a mix of shock, humiliation, and disappointment. He had spent years trying to maintain some semblance of a relationship with Mike, trying to be the good son, trying to win his father's approval, but it had always been one-sided. Mike's behavior at the party was the last straw. Jack realized that he had been taken for granted his entire life, and this moment was the culmination of years of mistreatment. Amanda, looking up at him with confusion and hurt in her eyes, only deepened Jack's sense of determination. No more would he allow his father to dictate how his family was treated. The party was supposed to be about Amanda, but instead, Mike had turned it into a painful reminder of all the ways Jack had been wronged. Mike, completely unfazed by his son Jack's fury, continued to mock him, his face twisted into a smug grin. There was no remorse, no recognition of the pain he had just caused. Instead, he doubled down on his arrogance, reinforcing his sense of superiority and entitlement. To Mike, this wasn't a big deal, just another family squabble he could laugh off. But to Jack, it was the last straw. His father's refusal to take any responsibility for his actions only deepened the anger and disappointment that had been simmering inside him for years. Jack's emotions, once boiling over, suddenly shifted. He realized that this moment wasn't just about a poorly chosen gift or a thoughtless comment. It was about reclaiming his power and finally standing up for himself. In a moment of profound clarity, Jack smiled calmly, the kind of smile that surprised everyone in the room. It was a smile that spoke volumes, a smile that said he was done. He turned towards the cake, took a deep breath, and cut two perfect slices. One for his daughter, Amanda, and one for Emily, his wife. Each slice was a quiet declaration of his intent. This wasn't just about protecting his daughter's feelings, it was about setting boundaries that should have been in place long ago. As he carefully placed the slices on plates, the entire room went eerily silent, as if they were all holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. Without a word, Jack turned to his father, his voice steady but firm, and said the words that would change everything. "You are no longer welcome here." It was a simple statement, but the weight of it hung in the air like a heavy fog. The room, already tense, seemed to freeze in place, every person there feeling the gravity of Jack's words. For a moment, Mike stood still, his face contorting in confusion, as if he hadn't fully processed the gravity of the situation. But Jack wasn't done. He had finally reached his breaking point, and there was no going back. The empowerment Jack felt in that moment was overwhelming. It wasn't just about kicking his father out, it was about taking control of his own life, his own boundaries, and his own family. For the first time, Jack stood tall, refusing to let Mike's behavior define him or his family any longer. The tension in the room was almost suffocating, but for Jack, it was a moment of pure determination. His father's mocking had lost its power over him. Jack had found his voice, and nothing would silence it again. For what felt like an eternity, the room was dead silent. Jack could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the soft clink of silverware on plates, but nothing else. His father and mother sat there, both visibly stunned, their eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way to break the oppressive silence. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react to the tension that had suddenly consumed the room. The joyous atmosphere of Amanda's birthday had vanished, replaced by an awkward stillness that seemed to suffocate everything. Amanda, sitting beside Emily, looked up at her father with tears welling up in her eyes. Jack could see the confusion on her face as she struggled to understand why her grandfather's actions had made the party feel like such a disaster. His heart broke as he watched his daughter's innocence collide with the harsh reality of the situation. She had been so excited for her birthday, eagerly anticipating the love and attention she'd receive from her family, but now she was left feeling abandoned and unloved by the very people who should have been there to celebrate her. Jack's own emotions were a whirlwind. He could feel the anger still simmering beneath the surface, but it was quickly replaced by a deep, gut-wrenching sense of anxiety. The realization that he had finally stood up to his father brought him a small sense of relief, but the weight of the moment was overwhelming. The silence was deafening, and for the first time, Jack questioned whether his actions had been too harsh. Had he done the right thing? Had he gone too far? Regret began to creep into his thoughts, and he found himself wrestling with the uncertainty of whether this moment would haunt him for years to come. But looking at Amanda, seeing her confusion and hurt, Jack's resolve only strengthened. This wasn't just about his father's disrespect, it was about ensuring Amanda never felt the sting of being less important, less valued than the others. The anxiety of the moment faded, replaced by the certainty that he had done what was necessary to protect his daughter. He had drawn a line, and he wasn't going to let anyone cross it again. In that silent room, Jack made a vow to himself and to Amanda. No matter what, he would never allow her to feel inferior to anyone in this family again. The moment Mike belittled Amanda in front of everyone, Jack felt a wave of anger surge through him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as his father's cruel words hung in the air. For years, Jack had endured the selfishness and favoritism Mike had shown towards his other grandchildren, but now, this was different. This wasn't just a passive insult, it was an attack on his daughter, and Jack could no longer stay silent. With his fists clenched and a fire in his eyes, Jack stood up from his seat. The room seemed to freeze, every eye shifting toward him as the tension thickened. His father, still with a smirk on his face, didn't expect the words that were about to come. Jack took a deep breath, steadying himself, but the anger and hurt he felt were impossible to suppress any longer. He stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with undeniable authority. "Enough, Dad," Jack said, his words cutting through the air. "You've been disrespecting me and everyone else for years, but this is where I draw the line." His voice, though steady, carried the weight of a lifetime of frustrations, and the room seemed to shrink as Jack's words hit like a slap to the face. He locked eyes with Mike, refusing to back down. "You treat my daughter like she's nothing. You've made it clear time and time again that she's not as important as Laura's kids, but I won't let you do this anymore." Jack's words were firm, each syllable laced with anger and a deep sense of protection for Amanda. He could feel the eyes of the guests on him, their silent anticipation hanging heavily in the air. He wasn't sure where this courage was coming from, but it felt right. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the moment he could no longer ignore the way his father had manipulated and controlled him for far too long. Fear flickered in Jack's chest, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of resolve. He wasn't afraid of his father anymore. He wasn't afraid of losing family or reputation. What mattered now was standing up for his daughter, showing her that she deserved better than this toxic dynamic. "You've humiliated her on her birthday, and that's unforgivable," Jack continued, his anger giving way to raw emotion. "You're selfish, and your favoritism ends here. I'm done." Mike stood frozen, his face contorted with disbelief. The room was quiet, and for the first time, Jack could see a flicker of doubt in his father's eyes, a crack in the facade that Mike had so carefully built for years. Jack knew the confrontation was far from over, but in that moment, he had taken back control. He had stepped into his own power, and it felt as though the weight of the years of manipulation had been lifted from his shoulders. He was no longer the victim. He was the protector. And nothing, not even his father, could take that away from him. After the explosive confrontation with his father, Jack felt a sense of clarity he had never experienced before. The anger and frustration that had built up for years now gave way to a quiet determination. For the first time, Jack knew what he had to do. He couldn't let his father's manipulation control him any longer, nor could he allow his daughter to grow up in a family where love was conditional and respect was earned only by fulfilling others' expectations. The days following the confrontation were filled with confusion, anger, and a sense of betrayal, but Jack knew deep down that this was the only way forward. As his mother and sister reached out to him, trying to make sense of his decision, Jack felt no hesitation. His father's years of cruel treatment and emotional manipulation had finally taken their toll. The years of constantly being there for his family, sacrificing his own time, money, and happiness, had led him to this breaking point. Jack had always been the dependable one, the one who put others' needs first. He worked tirelessly to help his family, never asking for anything in return, always sacrificing his own desires and dreams to play the role of the responsible son, brother, and father. But now he realized he had been nothing more than a pawn in his father's games, a resource to be used and discarded when it was no longer convenient. He couldn't keep living that way. It was time for him to reclaim his life. The decision to cut ties with his father was not an easy one, and the emotional weight of it was immense. His mother's pleas and his sister's guilt trips only intensified the struggle. But Jack's sense of liberation and relief overshadowed the pain. He had always tried to keep the peace, to maintain family harmony at the cost of his own well-being, but now he understood that true peace would only come when he took control of his own life. With a newfound strength, Jack walked away. He no longer felt like a doormat or a scapegoat. He was free from the toxic patterns that had defined his relationship with his father and the rest of his family. The clarity that followed this decision was transformative. For the first time, Jack felt like he could breathe freely, without the weight of manipulation, guilt, and resentment suffocating him. He had finally taken the necessary step to protect his peace and happiness, and in doing so, he found the strength to embrace a future free from the toxic hold of his father's influence. Mike's reaction was immediate and intense. For the first time in his life, he found himself completely cornered, unable to manipulate Jack or control the situation. His usual tactics, guilt-tripping, belittling, and emotional manipulation had always worked in the past, but now they fell flat. Jack, unwavering and resolute, refused to back down. There was no trace of guilt in his eyes, no hesitation in his voice. He had finally reached his breaking point. And this time, he wasn't going to let his father's influence ruin him or his family any longer. The shock on Mike's face was unmistakable. It was as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening. For years, he had expected Jack to roll over, to accept whatever treatment he dished out. He thought that, as the father, he could always maintain control, that his son would always be the one to bend. But now, for the first time, he saw the power shift. Jack, who had always been the obedient son, the one who made sacrifices, was now the one standing firm. He wasn't the same person Mike had manipulated for years. The realization hit Mike like a ton of bricks. The control he had so carefully constructed over the years was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do about it. For all his bluster, for all his bravado, Mike was now facing a son who had finally found his voice, who had broken free from the chains of manipulation. It was clear to Mike that Jack wasn't going to fold this time. The realization that Jack had finally seen through him and that he was no longer a willing participant in his games was almost more than Mike could bear. As Jack stood his ground, the weight of the situation settled in. Mike's usual defensive tactics of belittling and shaming didn't work. For once, Jack wasn't taking the blame. He wasn't backing down. Instead of the usual family drama, the room was filled with an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the distant sound of Mike's frustration. It was a turning point. Mike, so used to being the one in control, now found himself defeated, utterly powerless. His world, built on manipulation and control, was crumbling before him. He could only stand there, watching in disbelief, as his son stood tall, unwavering in his decision to cut ties. The realization that he had lost his grip on Jack was the final blow in their already fractured relationship. Jack wasn't just rejecting him. He was rejecting everything Mike had built their relationship on. For the first time, Mike understood that his son no longer feared him, and that realization marked the true defeat in their relationship. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack truly felt free. The weight that had been pressing on his shoulders for years, the constant manipulation, the toxic influence of his father, was finally gone. He was no longer bound by the expectations and demands of someone who had never truly respected him. The freedom Jack experienced in that moment was not just physical, it was emotional and mental as well. For the first time, he could breathe without fear of disappointment or guilt hanging over him. As he walked away from his father's manipulative grasp, Jack felt a surge of hope. His life no longer felt like a series of compromises or quiet sacrifices. He could finally make decisions based on what was best for him and his family, not out of obligation or fear of upsetting his father. It was an awakening. Jack realized that he had spent so much of his life playing the role of the dutiful son, but now he was playing the role of the man he was meant to be. A man who could stand tall, who could protect his family from the toxic forces that had once held him hostage. The peace that followed was not immediate, but it was palpable. Jack began focusing on what truly mattered: his wife, his daughter, and his own personal growth. He had a newfound clarity that guided him towards a happier life, one where he wasn't constantly drained by emotional manipulation or guilt. Instead of spending time trying to please someone who would never be satisfied, he began investing his energy into his own happiness and well-being. The shift was subtle at first, but it grew stronger each day. Jack found joy in the small moments, the laughter of his daughter, the quiet evenings spent with Emily, and the feeling of self-worth that came from making decisions for himself. He was no longer a pawn in his father's game, and that realization gave him a profound sense of peace. It was the kind of peace that came from knowing he was in control of his own destiny. No longer trapped by his father's influence, Jack felt hopeful about the future. It was a new chapter, one he had never thought possible, but now that it had begun, he was determined to make the most of it. Despite Jack's courageous decision to sever ties with his father and break free from years of emotional manipulation, the aftermath wasn't as peaceful as he had hoped. His family, particularly his mother and siblings, weren't ready to accept his boundaries. Instead of respecting his decision, they began bombarding him with increasingly harsh messages, accusing him of destroying the family, of being selfish, and of betraying them. The accusations felt like a weight on Jack's chest, a reminder of the emotional hold they had over him for so many years. At first, the guilt began to creep in. The familiar voices of his family, calling him out for his decision, left Jack questioning whether he had done the right thing. Was he truly doing what was best for himself and his family? Or was he turning his back on the people who had always been there, no matter how flawed their relationship had been? The anxiety was overwhelming at times, especially when he thought about the long-lasting consequences his decision might have on his relationship with his mother and siblings. But as the days passed, something shifted within Jack. The more his family tried to manipulate him with guilt and shame, the stronger his resolve became. He realized that prioritizing his own well-being was not just the right choice, it was the necessary one. He had spent too many years putting the needs and demands of others before his own, constantly sacrificing his happiness for the sake of family harmony. This time, Jack refused to let that happen again. The resilience he had built over the years came to the forefront. The emotional manipulation no longer had the same power over him. His father's tactics, his mother's pleas, and his siblings' accusations lost their sting. Jack stood firm in his decision, understanding that sometimes the greatest act of love is to set boundaries, even when those boundaries upset others. He wasn't destroying the family. He was protecting his own mental and emotional health, ensuring that he could be the best version of himself for his wife and daughter. Despite the anxiety that still lingered, Jack's defiance and resilience grew stronger each day. He was no longer a puppet in his family's drama. The decision to prioritize his own happiness was liberating, and it was this newfound strength that gave him the peace and clarity he had longed for. Jack had finally broken free, and he wasn't going back. The final break in Jack's journey to freedom came when his mother, for the first time, acknowledged the toxic dynamics that had shaped their family for so long. It wasn't an easy moment for either of them, but it was one that Jack had been quietly waiting for. His mother, who had spent years silently supporting his father's manipulation, finally found the strength to speak up. She admitted that she had always remained quiet, too afraid to challenge his father's control, but now she was ready to take control of her own life. For Jack, this moment was bittersweet. While he had longed for his mother to stand up for herself and for him, the reality of it brought a flood of emotions. He realized that the damage his father had caused wasn't just to him, it was to everyone around him. The years of emotional manipulation, favoritism, and control had hurt his mother just as much as it had hurt Jack. It became clear that his mother had been a victim of the same toxic behavior for decades, living in the shadow of his father's power and dominance. There was sadness in this realization. Jack had hoped for a better family dynamic, one where they could all stand together against the toxicity that had been perpetuated for so long. He had dreamed of a family where respect and love were mutual, where each person's needs were valued equally. But the truth was, his father's grip on their lives had been so strong that it had warped the relationships and left scars that couldn't be easily healed. Jack's heart ached for the years of silence his mother had endured, for the opportunities lost to break free, and for the toll that this toxic environment had taken on their entire family. However, within this sadness was a sense of empowerment. Jack's mother's decision to step up and take control of her life was a powerful moment of clarity. It was a moment of growth and self-awareness, a decision that showed that, even after years of manipulation, it was never too late to change. Jack had longed for this day, and now that it had arrived, he could finally see the full picture of what had been going on behind closed doors. The chains that had bound his family for so long were beginning to loosen, and Jack realized that the final break from his father's toxic influence was not just his own, it was a moment of liberation for his mother as well. Jack's resolve was stronger than ever. The clarity he gained from his mother's confession allowed him to finally let go of the lingering guilt and sadness that had haunted him. He was no longer a victim of his father's manipulation, and neither was his mother. For the first time in their lives, they both had the power to create the life they deserved, free from the control that had shaped their past. With his family no longer a constant presence in his life, Jack finally embraced the freedom he had longed for. It was as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and for the first time in years, he could breathe without the constant pressure of guilt and anxiety. The decision to cut ties with his father and step away from the toxic dynamics of his family had opened a door to a new chapter in his life, one where he could prioritize his own happiness and well-being. Jack's newfound peace was a gradual process. For so long he had been caught in the cycle of pleasing others, putting his family's needs before his own, and sacrificing his own desires for their expectations. But now, with the space he had created for himself, he began to explore what truly brought him joy. He took vacations without worrying about any looming obligations. He went on trips to places he had always wanted to visit but had never been able to, free from the feeling of guilt that had once followed him. He reconnected with old friends, enjoying laughter and companionship without the shadow of familial tension hanging over him. In addition to the vacations and reconnecting with loved ones, Jack also began engaging in self-care. He took time to nurture his physical and mental health, something that had been neglected for far too long. He joined a local gym, started eating healthier, and even took up meditation to quiet his mind. He was learning to prioritize himself, to recognize his own worth, and to celebrate the small victories that he had overlooked in the past. For the first time, Jack felt confident in his decisions. He wasn't second-guessing himself or fearing judgment from his family. He knew that by stepping away from their toxicity, he had taken control of his life. There was no more apologizing for taking care of himself. No more guilt over setting boundaries. No more feeling like he had to carry the emotional burden of others. Jack's journey was one of personal growth and liberation. The man who had once been trapped in a web of manipulation and guilt was now a person fully in charge of his own destiny. He was no longer defined by his family's expectations, but by his own values and desires. He had learned that peace comes not from pleasing others, but from embracing one's own path and living authentically. As Jack stood at the edge of this new life, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons learned. It had been a long and painful road to get to this point, but it had been worth every step. He was free to be himself, free to live without fear, and free to pursue a future filled with happiness, confidence, and peace. Jack's decision to cut ties with his family was not an easy one, and it came with its fair share of heartache. For years he had tried to meet their expectations, to be the perfect son, the reliable brother. He had believed that family loyalty meant putting others' needs before his own, sacrificing his happiness to keep the peace. But over time, he realized that this loyalty had come at a significant cost to his mental health. His family had always taken, never giving back, in ways that made him feel valued or appreciated. As the days passed after the final break, Jack couldn't help but reflect on everything he had left behind. He thought about the years spent trying to make his family proud, the sacrifices he had made, and the emotional toll it had taken on him. For a long time, he had believed that family should come first, no matter the cost. But as he looked back, he began to see the cracks in that belief. His father's manipulation, his mother's silence, and his siblings' expectations had all weighed heavily on him. The love he had once given so freely had been met with disrespect and disregard. Despite the sadness that lingered in his heart, Jack felt a deep sense of empowerment. For the first time, he had chosen himself. He had set boundaries, stood up for his own well-being, and walked away from a toxic environment that had drained him for years. The freedom he felt was overwhelming. It was as if a heavy burden had been lifted, and he was finally able to breathe without the constant pressure of family demands. The decision wasn't about abandoning his family. It was about taking control of his life, and Devoval 711 at avobri.com, finding peace. Jack had spent so long trying to please others, trying to be everything they wanted him to be, that he had lost sight of who he was. Now, with the space to reconnect with himself, he realized that he was worthy of love, respect, and peace. Not just from others, but from himself as well. As Jack closed this chapter of his life, he found closure. The sadness of leaving behind a family who never truly understood his worth was still there, but the clarity that came with his decision made it bearable. He knew he had done the right thing. In the end, the price of family loyalty had been too high, and his decision to prioritize his own mental health and happiness was worth every ounce of pain. The road ahead was his to walk, and he was ready to live it on his own terms. The story of Jack's journey is a powerful reminder of the importance of setting boundaries, even with family, and recognizing when relationships are no longer healthy. For many of us, family is something we are taught to prioritize above all else, but sometimes, unconditional loyalty can come at the expense of our own well-being. As we age, it's crucial to remember that our mental health, peace, and self-respect are just as important as the love we give to others. Jack's experience teaches us that there comes a time when we must walk away from toxic relationships, even if they are with those we once held dear. It's not about abandoning family, it's about preserving our dignity and choosing a life that nurtures us rather than drains us. The lesson here is not just about protecting ourselves from harm, but also about taking the courage to reclaim our lives and prioritize our happiness. In our later years, when we reflect on the time we have left, it's vital to make space for the people and experiences that truly enrich our lives. Never let anyone, no matter how close, diminish your worth or rob you of your peace. You have the right to choose joy, to find freedom, and to live a life full of respect and self-love. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you found this video on generational conflict insightful. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Silent Wars for more valuable content. We truly appreciate your support and look forward to bringing you more videos that matter to you. See you in the next video.